out! Your sister needs this house more. And since you're fired, who is paying for her car loan?
Your work has slipped completely, so we are letting you go immediately while your sister takes over your desk.
You fired me yesterday, but as majority shareholder and CEO of your parent company, you have 10 minutes left.
Please pick up. We were evicted today, lost the SUV, and desperately need you to save us right.
Get out. Your sister needs the house more than you do, and we've already given her your room, my father said, tossing my final luggage bag onto the wet driveway. Behind him stood my younger sister, wearing my favorite sweater, crossing her arms with a smirk that practically dripped with triumph. She looked me up and down, adjusted her watch, and sneered, "Since you're fired and packing, who's handling my car loan now? Because I'm not paying for it." My mother didn't even look me in the eye. She just kept hovering around my sister, patting her shoulder like she was the one who had suffered a tragic blow. "Be reasonable," my mother murmured, her voice laced with fake sympathy. "She's starting her new job next week. She needs a stable home. And you, well, you don't have a career to worry about anymore, do you?" The rain began to drizzle, matching the dismal coldness of their expressions. Every neighbor on our quiet suburban street was watching from behind their curtains. I stood on the asphalt, jobless, homeless, and stripped of the only family I knew, while the people who were supposed to love me treated me like garbage to be thrown onto the curb. They had no idea what was coming. But that's not where this story began. 3 months earlier, I was just the quiet, dutiful eldest daughter. For 5 years, I had been the silent provider for my family. When my sister wanted a luxury SUV to fit her aesthetic, I put my name on the lease and made the monthly payments. When my parents claimed they were falling behind on their mortgage, I quietly transferred money into their account every single month. I never asked for praise, and I never complained. Because I stayed quiet, they assumed I was weak. They assumed I was just a mid-level accountant grinding away at a mid-sized asset management firm, desperate for their approval. They mistook my silence for submission. That was their first mistake. My sister was the golden child. Everything she touched was treated like gold, even though she hadn't held a stable job in 3 years. My parents threw her lavish birthday parties while forgetting mine entirely. Every dinner was a parade of her superficial achievements, while my 80-hour work weeks were dismissed with comments like, "It's a shame you don't have time to find a husband like your sister." Whenever I tried to set boundaries, the gaslighting began. "Family helps family," my mother would scold. "Don't be selfish. You have enough money. Why are you hoarding it?" What they didn't know, what nobody in that family knew, was the true extent of my financial life. 6 years ago, I didn't just join that asset management firm. I built a private, independent holding company alongside 2 silent partners from business school. Through strategic investments, acquiring undervalued real estate, and strictly keeping my name off the front page, our private firm grew into a massive powerhouse holding over $50 million in assets. Among those assets were commercial properties, suburban residential developments, and a stunning 4-story oceanfront beach house down the coast. I never brought my wealth home. I lived modestly, drove a 7-year-old sedan, and let my family believe I was just barely scraping by. I wanted to know if they loved me, or if they loved what I could do for them. The answer came on a Tuesday afternoon. My sister had applied for a junior position at a prestigious finance company in the city. What she didn't realize was that my holding firm had acquired a controlling 60% stake in that exact company just 2 months prior. The executives reported directly to my board. When my sister found out I worked in the same industry, she didn't ask for advice. Instead, she went to my parents and claimed I was sabotaging her career out of jealousy. That night, my father called me, yelling into the phone, threatening to cut me off entirely if I didn't use my contacts to force her hiring. The very next day, my boss at my day job, a smug man who had been taking credit for my portfolio algorithms for 2 years, called me into his office. Beside him sat my sister, looking like a cat that had swallowed a canary. "We're restructuring," my boss announced with a condescending grin. "And frankly, your work has been slipping. We need fresh, dynamic talent. Your sister brought it to our attention that you've been using company resources for personal projects. We're letting you go, effective immediately." My sister didn't even try to hide her grin. She had pulled strings through an old college friend who worked in HR to fabricate a story, framing me for data theft so she could take my desk. I sat there, looking at my boss, then at my sister. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't plead for my job. I simply stacked my notebooks, stood up, and walked out. Remember that detail. It matters later. When I arrived home to pack my personal belongings, my father had already changed the locks. He handed me 2 trash bags filled with my clothes and told me to get off his property. My sister demanded the keys to her car, and my mother demanded I hand over my savings account details to pay off my sister's credit card debt as compensation for my alleged sabotage. Standing in the rain, looking at 3 faces filled with hatred, greed, and arrogance, I took a deep breath. Is this really what you want? I asked calmly. Get lost, my father sneered. You're a disgrace. You're nothing without this family. I didn't say a word about the firm I controlled. I said nothing about the oceanfront beach house waiting for me down the coast. I simply turned around, got into my old sedan, and drove away into the night. They thought they had broken me. They thought they had taken everything. They had no idea they had just pulled the pin on a grenade. Hours later, the clock struck midnight. I was sitting in the high-backed leather chair of the top-floor penthouse office at my holding firm, dry, dressed in a tailored suit, sipping espresso. My legal counsel and chief financial officer stood across from my desk, holding a stack of legal folders. Are you sure you want to execute all of these at once? My attorney asked, a dark smile playing on his lips. Every single one, I replied softly. Start with the house. The downfall was rapid, ruthless, and absolute. At 8 a.m. the following morning, a team of sheriff's deputies and process servers arrived at my parents' front door. My father opened the door in his bathrobe, expecting the morning paper. Instead, he was handed an immediate, mandatory eviction notice and a summons for high court foreclosure. What my parents had forgotten, or rather, never bothered to read, was that 5 years ago, when they begged me to save their home, I didn't just pay their mortgage. I bought the deed from the bank through a legal subsidiary. They weren't paying a mortgage. They were paying me rent under a revocable lease agreement. An agreement that required the tenant not to breach conduct terms. By unlawfully throwing me out and changing the locks on a property I owned outright, they had breached the contract. They were given exactly 2 hours to pack their belongings into trash bags and clear off the premises. Before the shock could even settle, my sister's sleek luxury SUV was hooked up to a tow truck right in front of the neighbors. Since the lease was legally in my name, I revoked her authorized driver status and reported the vehicle recovered. When she ran out screaming, threatening to call the police, the repo driver simply handed her a notice of civil suit. I was suing her for 3 years of backdated car payments, interest, and fraud. But the real masterpiece of the reveal was yet to come. At 11 a.m., a mandatory emergency board meeting was called at my former day job's headquarters. My former boss had convened the senior management team to introduce their star new hire, my sister. They were all sitting around the massive glass conference table, laughing, drinking coffee, celebrating my termination. My sister was sitting at the head of the table, gloating to the junior analysts about how she was taking over my portfolio. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors swung open. In walked 4 senior corporate attorneys, followed by 2 armed security guards, and finally, me. The room went dead silent, drop of a pin quiet. My former boss stood up, his face turning bright red with anger. "What is the meaning of this?" he yelled, slamming his hand on the table. "You were fired yesterday. Get this crazy woman out of my building." My lead attorney stepped forward, unbuttoning his coat, and slid a heavy leather binder down the center of the glass table. "I suggest you watch your tongue," my attorney said, his voice echoing in the silent room. "You are speaking to the chief executive officer, majority shareholder, and ultimate owner of this parent holding company. Effective 20 minutes ago, your board of directors was dissolved, and all executive powers have been transferred directly to her." The room erupted into collective gasps. Pens were dropped. Coffee cups froze midair. My sister's face drained of every ounce of color. She looked at me, her mouth hanging open, trembling. What? No, she's just an accountant. She lives in a tiny room. She has nothing." I walked slowly to the head of the table. The security guards immediately pulled out the grand executive chair for me. I sat down, crossed my legs, and leaned forward, resting my chin on my hands. "I gave you 5 years of my life," I said softly, looking my former boss dead in the eyes. "And you traded it for cheap corporate politics." I turned my gaze to my sister, whose hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold her phone, which was currently buzzing uncontrollably with panicked texts from our homeless parents. "You asked who was handling your car loan," I said, my voice dripping with icy calm. "The answer is no one. The car is gone. The house is gone, and as for your job here," I looked at the legal team. "Terminate her application. Issue an industry-wide compliance flag for resume fraud and corporate espionage based on the false internal reports she filed against me." My former boss sank into his chair, his jaw slack, his skin instantly pale. "Please," he stammered, his arrogance completely evaporated. "We didn't know if we had known who you were." "That's the point," I interrupted smoothly. "You only respect power. You don't respect value." I stood up, adjusted my blazer, and looked down at my weeping sister and paralyzed ex-boss. "Clear your desks. Both of you, you have 10 minutes. The cascade didn't stop there. Over the next 3 weeks, the consequences multiplied like a falling line of dominoes. My parents had to move into a tiny, run-down one-bedroom rental on the far side of town, funded entirely by my father's meager retirement check. Their grand social circle abandoned them the moment the story of their greed spread through the town. My sister, burdened with a ruined credit score, a civil fraud lawsuit, and a blacklisted reputation in the finance industry, was forced to take 2 part-time retail jobs just to pay off her legal fees. As for me, I moved my primary operations to my oceanfront estate. I spent my mornings watching the sunrise over the waves from my wraparound balcony, surrounded by peace, quiet, and genuine success. I didn't celebrate wildly. I didn't post gloating messages on social media. True power doesn't need to shout. They tried to call me, dozens of times. My mother left tearful voicemails begging for forgiveness, claiming they were manipulated. My father sent frantic texts asking for a second chance. I never replied. I simply changed my number. They treated me like trash when they thought I had nothing. They only wanted my grace when they realized I owned everything. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were dealing with? Tell me your story in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more revenge stories every week.